Hi, and welcome everybody to our second AI Masterclass, Start Building AI Skills. So as a quick reminder, first of all, this is a continuation on our first Masterclass we did about AI Thinking Buddy. I would like to remind everybody, just like our first Masterclass, everything that I showed today on the slides, you're going to be receiving in a handout afterwards, so make sure that you signed up for that. Including extra handouts describing in more detail some of the things that we go through today. Okay. Nice to see everybody. I'm Tiago. I'm a partner at Agilat. And for the last year and a half, I've been experimenting, investigating with AI tools and some of the clients that we work with, and also for myself, for my personal productivity. And over that time, we've been building a learning journey focused on AI use for non-technical people, right? And this is the second main building block of that learning journey. Feel free to check our website for more courses that we have on AI if you want to go deeper on any of these things. Also, we wanted to ask a question before we start. Sorry, I'm still getting used to this YouTube live stuff. And the question was, we were curious to know who here was already present in the first masterclass we did. It's not necessary. The topics we're discussing are independent from each other. But as we mentioned last time, the skills build up on each other. So it's interesting for us to know who was here on the first time. You should see a question about that in the poll. Good. We don't have a lot of time and we have a lot of stuff to cover. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. So start building AI skills, scale your productivity. First thing, just a 2-second recap on the main takeaways from the previous session that we did, because these kind of matter for what we're discussing today also, right? Like we mentioned before, these skills build on each other. So the first point that we discussed in our first masterclass was iterate with AI, right? You can't just ask for an output and then expect to get the right output. You're going to have to iterate with it, using AI as a thinking buddy. The other thing we talked about is using projects, right? So one of the challenges you have when you're working with AI tools is that every session has its own little memory, but when you start a new session, it kind of forgets everything you did in a previous session. So when you set up a project, it allows you to keep context over multiple sessions. And actually this context compounds over time, right? So the more you work with your AI tool in that project, the more it knows about the context it needs to do valuable work for you within that context. Third thing we discussed in our first masterclass was the ability to define the problem you want AI to solve, right? AI is very good at running through and trying to solve problems, but you need to define the right problem for it. If not, you might be running into some problems. And last thing is to remember that, at least in the way that we're discussing it here, AI is much more of augmenting your impact, right? You're still responsible for what's happening. This is not just about delegating and forgetting. This is about using AI effectively to increase your productivity in whatever type of work you do, okay? One other important comment before we continue. I'm going to be using Claude today for the demo that we do, for the skills that I created and that we're going to be showing. But everything we're discussing here today, just like in our first masterclass, is applicable to whatever AI tool you're using, right? So if you're using ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude or Copilot, all the things we're discussing here today can be applied to any of those tools. We're going to have a handout explaining how the terminology might differ between the tools. But everything we do here today, you can use in any of those tools, okay? All right, so what's our agenda for today? First thing we're going to talk about is we're going to be focusing on, there is no common terminology for this, what I call specialists, right? Or skills if you want, right? What are these specialists? We're going to be talking about workflows, because now that you're starting to give the AI tool a little bit more responsibility and expecting like a better output that it's generating, you need to start thinking in workflows about how you're going to be collaborating with it. We're going to go through the process of setting up a specialist, discussing human-in-the-loop workflows and why they're important. And lastly, how do we maintain a specialist library, right? So once you start creating these different specialists, all of a sudden you have 3, 5, 10, it starts to become many. So how do you maintain a library to make sure that you're on top of it and you're making sure that your specialists are working as you expect? All right, so what are specialists? This is the slide we showed on in our first masterclass, but on our y-axis, we have human involvement, right? So when you're using AI tools, sometimes you're very involved. The classic example is a chatbot, right? You have to ask a question for it to do anything. So that requires high human involvement. The x-axis is about autonomy, right? How much autonomy does the AI tool have? So on the left side, it doesn't have a lot of autonomy, like a chatbot, for example. It basically can do nothing but reply to your questions with some text. Or you can start adding capabilities and autonomy to these tools, and then they can do more and more things. Specialists are the one in the bottom left. What that means is human involvement goes down. You're going to be configuring an AI specialist that can handle repetitive type of work, right? That's why human involvement becomes low, because you first need to define this process it follows. But once it has a clear understanding of the process, the input and the output it needs to generate, then you can just trigger it and it's going to do the job, and it doesn't need a lot of involvement for you, okay? All right, so what do specialists do and when are they useful? So if we just think about a simple workflow, you have a goal, like for example, okay, we need to provide customer support for the app users that we have. So there's an input to that, might be an email or a call from a customer, for example. There might be multiple steps that we go through in that workflow. Potentially these steps are even broken down into tasks. And then in the end, there's an output, right? The deliverable that we do when we close that workflow, when we've achieved the goal or the value of the workflow. So specialists, what can they do? For the tasks, or sometimes the steps, if they're small enough, that are very repetitive, right? So it's always the same kind of inputs, the same kind of process, and the same kind of output. Specialists are very good at that. And the second part is you have a clear input and output, right? Those don't change a lot. So if these are stable, that means an AI specialist could handle this. You can configure a specialist to do the job. When to use them is when the task that you're considering delegating to a specialist is frequent enough that it represents a non-trivial amount of your time, right? So if this is something you do, I don't know, 3-4 times a year and it takes you about 15 minutes each time, it's probably not worth to configure an AI specialist for it. Just go ahead and do it yourself. But if this is something that takes up 3, 4, 8 hours a week for you, then yes, then it's worth investing the time to create a specialist for you, right? So make sure the task is repetitive. And the other part is you're able to train the specialist, right? Because it's not just about defining the process. You need to know more than the process. You need to have the ability to evaluate the outputs that it's generating so that you can train it. Because bad news, just like an employee that you hire, if you want to configure a new AI specialist, it's going to take some training to get it to deliver work at the quality that you need. So what are the main parts of a specialist? And again, I use the word specialist as a generic word, not to confuse people too much. If you're using Gemini, these are called gems. If you're using ChatGPT, these are called GPTs. If you're using Claude, these are called skills, etc. Right? So different tools will call them different things, but it's these AI tools that are able to handle repetitive type tasks, right? So first part of a specialist would be the persona. So typically you're going to give it a persona. You're an analyst, you're a marketer or something, right? So that it already gets the mindsets that it needs to accomplish the task. What is the context? So you're going to have to explain to it, okay, any applicable processes. You're going to have to give it examples like of previous tasks and inputs and outputs so that it understands the context. It has domain knowledge. Then you're going to have to make sure it has the right capabilities. A lot of these AI tools, like Claude, the one I'm using, it can create Excel files, etc. So it has some capabilities already embedded in it. But you could potentially have to add access to other tools or capabilities to be able to complete that task in the workflow. So that's another part of a specialist. The input and output, like we said, so you need to have a good understanding of what's going to be the inputs, the trigger for that specialist, and what is the output that you're expecting it to generate. And lastly, the edge cases, right? So what happens if things don't go well? Maybe the input you provide this one time is not so good as the other times, and it misses some information, but not all the information. Or something else happens, like how does it handle when things don't go perfectly according to the process? What should it do? And I think it's also important here because I'm not a technical person myself. So one of the things I'm very happy about what's happening with AI tools now is that setting up a specialist or programming a specialist, you don't really need to code, right? Anybody can create a specialist. The example I'm sharing here on the screen, there is a popular one called Grill Me, which is basically supposed to, if you're building up a plan or something like that, it's just going to ask you a bunch of questions and grill you so that you can make sure your plan is really, really stable and well thought out of, and you don't have any holes or blind spots that you're missing. And you see here that it went viral. It's a very famous skill, and the whole skill is here on the slide. It's like 3 paragraphs, very short. You can understand it, and you can edit it potentially if you wanted to, right? So you don't need to be able to code to create a specialist. So another question we're curious about is, have you already created a specialist? So for the people that are here, like I would like to know, have you already tried to create one of these specialists, something that does a recurring task for you, and train it, etc.? Let us know in the poll. All right, continuing, thinking in workflows. So as I said, different than the chatbot when we talked about in the first masterclass, where you're dealing usually with more punctual things or problems that you're trying to solve. When you talk about a specialist, typically you're going to be thinking in workflows, right? So I'm going to use an example. I'm the product owner of an app called Beanstalk. So just a second, I can show it to you here. And it's basically an app that helps knowledge workers assess their skills. And so you see here, like, if I can take different assessments, I can take the assessment for a Scrum Master, a stakeholder, OKR Maestro, like different things. And each assessment is going to be it's a self-assessment. It's a series of questions that I'm answering or skills that I should have, right? So can I contrast the product backlog, how they're split in different ways, etc. And I can answer yes, partially, not yet, okay? Just a second, I'll go back to the slides. Yes. So this is the app I'm a product owner for, and it's the app I'm going to be using as an example as we go through, like, how do we work with a specialist? So first step is, when you're trying to think about how a specialist could help you, is identify your key workflows. Like, if I think about Beanstalk, right, and my work as product owner of Beanstalk, what takes up my time? Right? So I make a list of those different workflows. So I have to create new assessments. I have to create new learning videos. We do some social media marketing. We have to support active customers who have questions or issues. We're developing new features actively. We're trying to sell to new clients, mostly B2B for the moment. We have to do invoicing and accounting. And I'm also doing research of latest trends and developments in learning and development in general, so that I can keep up with what's going on in the learning and development environment, right? So once I have these key workflows identified, next step is prioritize the workflows. Don't just pick anything randomly to do it. How do you prioritize these workflows? There's different techniques. One that I like and I've been using is going to ask two different questions on the prioritization side, right? One is about the feasibility of using a specialist to address or help out in this workflow, right? So for the feasibility, I have 4 categories that I'm ranking on a scale of 1 to 5, right? So repetitiveness. How repetitive is this task? Is it always the same thing, or does it change and every time there's a little bit difference in it? What is the availability of data and examples like? So do I have a lot of examples I can already share with the AI tool, or do we have no examples right now? This is something new we're setting up for the first time. What is the structure of the inputs and outputs? So is it always the same type of input and the same type of output and the same structure, or is there variance there? And lastly, how stable is the process, right? Because sometimes some of the things we're doing, those processes are changing very frequently. But if your business processes are changing, then you're going to need to adapt your specialist to match your business process. So you want fairly stable processes that are not changing very, very fast, right? Well, you could do it, but you're going to have to change your specialist also very, very often. So you would score them. That's what I did for my Beanstalk workflows. Score them on a scale of 1 to 5, right? So 1 means it's not very repetitive, 5 meaning it's very repetitive, which means there's a maximum score of 20 here on the feasibility criteria. And then the other criteria I'm looking at is value, of course. So one is like, how feasible is it to use an AI specialist to help me here? And then the other question is, okay, how valuable is it if I use an AI specialist here? And for that, I'm interested in the frequency. The comment I was making at the beginning, right? Is this something you do once a month, or is this something you do every other day? So the frequency is going to impact the value. The more frequent you have to do this, the more valuable it's going to be, of course, because it's going to be reducing the time you spend on that. How long does it take you to do it? Is this something, a task that when it comes up, it takes you a minute to do and that's it? Or do you need more time to do it? And is it logic-based or intuition-based, right? Some people would argue, like when I was showing this to some people, like the logic base should be in the feasibility side. But the point is, if the task you're asking it to do is not a very logic-based task, it's an intuitive task, the AI is not going to be able to add a lot of value, because you're still going to have to review and edit a lot of what it's generating because it lacks that intuition. It's just not something it's good at. But if it's a very logic-based task, then AI can add a lot of value to it and can deliver an output that's going to be pretty good or close enough or even perfect for what you need, therefore saving you a lot of time and delivering value, right? And these you would score on a scale of 1 to 5, and you have a max score here of 15. So if you think about this, the feasibility criteria I would treat as gatekeepers, right? It's not that you add the score on both sides and the highest score, the higher priority. I prefer to treat it as the feasibility criteria gives me, it's like a gatekeeper. So I'm going to have a minimum score, for example, 14. And anything below 14 is just not a good candidate. If it's over 14, it's a good candidate. And then I'm going to take a look at the value to prioritize them, right? So the sequence of the priority of the workflows I should work on is determined by the value criteria. But whether I should work on them or not, the gatekeeper is determined by the feasibility. So just as an example, my create new assessments workflow, right? So if I'm adding a new assessment to Beanstalk, I did the exercise for all the workflows. Here's the answer for the create new assessments. And you see there, right? So it's fairly repetitive, the process of creating new assessments. I have a lot of assessments already present in Beanstalk, so we have a lot of data, a lot of examples. The structure of it is very similar. Every assessment has the same structure. And the process for creating them is fairly stable, right? On the value side, okay, I'm not creating new assessments for the app every week. However, when I do have to create new assessments, it is a lot of work, right? Because you have to think about, like, if I'm creating, the most recent one we created was for design thinking, right? It's not just, okay, I sit down in a couple of hours, I write down all the questions. I have to think about design thinking. I have to think about the experience I've had, what I know, and start building out an assessment that's going to have different maturity levels. It takes time, right? But it is fairly logic-based. Why? Also because I already have trainings. I've been giving trainings on all these topics for the last, I don't know, almost 20 years now. So I do have a lot of structure to how I teach this and to the skills that people should develop in these topics, right? So it is fairly logic-based in that sense. So you see there, it gets a score on value and a score on feasibility. Now, if we were to map this in a simple 2x2, right? So the value score is on the y-axis, the feasibility score is on the x-axis. Of course, top right, those are the best candidates, right? So there's high value, high feasibility score. The ones on the top left, I call them future candidates, right? So they don't pass that minimum required level I have for feasibility, so the gatekeeper concept, right? So they're not good candidates right now, but they do bring a lot of value. So maybe if I can, for whatever is making it unfeasible right now, we don't have a lot of examples, the process is changing very frequently. If we can simplify those things or fix those things, then they might become feasible and best candidates, right? The ones on the bottom left clearly don't do. Like, they don't bring you a lot of value, and they're also not very feasible. Just keep doing that work how you're doing right now. The ones on the bottom right, I'm calling good practice, because if you want to start doing this, it's always a risk. Imagine if this is like my creating new assessments. That's a super valuable workflow for me, because that's one of the core functionalities and values of the app, right? So if we do something wrong there, it has a big impact on our users. So maybe I want to first practice with a workflow that's not so valuable, but very feasible, just so I get the hang of how it's like to create a specialist and train it, etc., in a more safer environment. So I'm calling those good practice if you want. So if I map the workflows I had for my Beanstalk app here, you can see very clearly most of them don't pass that feasibility minimum score yet, right? But I have 3 potential candidates. So create new learning videos, create new assessments, invoicing and accounting. Now, what I did is then, I did the score for everybody. The best one was create a new assessment. So that's the one that brings the most value and has the highest feasibility score. So that's the one I'm starting with. So again, the idea of thinking in workflows, right? So what you need to do now is not just, okay, I'm going to create a specialist to run that entire part. Because as we're going to see, I don't want the AI tool to just create an assessment for me by itself. And we'll discuss why in a second, right? So what's going to happen there is now I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that workflow and map the different steps and potentially subtasks, right? So I have a goal here. I want to create a new skills assessment that is available for users in the app. So it starts with usually me identifying a new assessments that we should work on. Then we need to define the learning objectives. We need to create the maturity model. We need to create the assessment questions. Then we need to write test questions. Then we need to update Coda, which is the application we use for the database of the app. And then the new assessment is available in the app, right? And what I did is I just applied the same prioritization technique I was describing before to the different steps in my highest priority workflow. And you see there, okay, the best one to focus on right now would be write the test questions, as a feasibility of 19, so very, very high, and a value of 14, very, very high. An important point here, and we're going to be diving deeper in this in a second. Of course, these scores are subjective, right? When I'm saying, okay, how repetitive is this? How much time do I take to do this? Some of this is, you can measure it, it's factual. But is it logic-based, for example, right? There is a little bit of a feeling that comes in when you're giving these scores. And for me personally, I am not comfortable yet in focusing on a specialist on the first 3 steps of this workflow, because I think that's where a lot of the value on the Beanstalk app is. So I don't want to just quote unquote outsource this to AI. I still want to own those. But the right to the test questions, once we have the learning objectives well defined, we have a maturity model defined, we have the assessment questions defined. The test questions is one that, yes, I'm comfortable in getting some help there. I'm not delegating it fully, as we'll see in a second, but there I think it could really help us. Good. So just a second, I will switch here and I will show you how this works on Beanstalk, just to give you a better idea. Yeah, that's correct. So you see here, I'm saying the task I chose to focus on is create test questions. So if you're here on the app, you see I've already, in this assessment I've created, I've already reached PO level 1. So there's a test now connected to it. So basically the task we're working on is creating these kinds of questions, right? So it's going to be multiple choice questions that I have, and then I can come and answer and to test my knowledge on these skills that I've just self-assessed on. That's what we're working on here. All right. And we're back here. So the next concept I want to discuss, right, before you start actually setting up the specialist or designing the updates to your workflow, is the question of trust, right? So I already hinted on it a little bit when I said some of these scorings can be a little bit subjective, but you need to decide for the task that you're working on to give to the specialist, how much trust do you have on the specialist to execute this task, right? So 0 trust, for example, means I don't trust AI to do this for me, right? So for example, write the learning objectives. For sure, if I ask AI to write learning objectives for design thinking training and write a good prompt, it's going to do it. But I don't trust AI to do that, because the whole point of the app is, okay, it's taking our perspective and our experience, and it's one of what we consider as the value add. So if I just outsource that to AI, then I'm giving up one of our value adds. For other tasks, I might have full trust. Like, I don't know, invoicing and accounting. If it's like scanning travel receipts, I might create a specialist for that and just have it send the email directly to the accountant. And after I train it and make sure it works, but I might trust it fully to just send it to the accountant. There's also a check there, because if something is wrong, the accountant is going to call me. So it's like, that might be one where I have more trust, right? For everything else in the middle, we're going to be working on what's called with human in the loop workflows, right? So I don't have 0 trust. I'm going to be using an AI specialist for it, but I don't have full trust. So I'm going to be involved in the workflow. That's what human in the loop means. Somewhere along the workflow, I'm going to be checking what they did or giving some feedback or something like that. So let's focusing back in on the right test questions, right? For this one, it's one that I have fairly high trust, not full trust for sure. But the inputs and outputs are always the same. It's basically creating test questions to test for the self-assessment questions we have that have detailed acceptance criteria, have learning objectives, etc. So I feel that, okay, the specialist can do probably a decent enough job to create test questions that it's going to be able to save me some time. However, I still want to have review of those test questions. I don't want to just be publishing test questions in the app that I haven't checked. So it's going to be a human in the loop workflow where I'm manually checking the test questions that were created. So what's the process here? Well, first you need to think about, okay, what's my high level process for creating those test questions, right? So I need to capture, okay, we have different types of test questions. We have multiple choice and rank questions. We want to try to have 2 test questions per self-assessment question. And we're going to have a human review, so a human in the loop type workflow. Next thing I'm thinking about is, okay, do I have examples of good test questions or not? Because if I don't remember, then this is going to be a problem. So I need to capture those examples and make sure I collect them and have them all in one place. And I need to have defined clearly the output I want. Note that for the moment, you're going to see in the workflow I show in a second, but the output I wanted is an Excel file. I'm not giving the specialist access to Coda, to our database for the app. Why? Because I don't trust it fully. And if it messes something up in there, it has a big impact on us. So first I want to make sure that this is working well and it gives me an Excel, and I'll do the upload to Coda, right? Okay, so the step there is, for that step of the workflow that says write test questions, I'm going to be redrawing that workflow. And you see here I have 2 swim lanes, right? So there's a human in that swim lane, and then there's the AI swim lane. And that's the idea of human in the loop workflows. So how does this work? I define the learning objectives, I create the maturity model, I create the assessment questions, and then AI goes and creates the first batch of test questions. It hands it off to me, and I'm going to review those test questions. Then I have a decision to make. Am I okay with them? Are they good or not? If they're not good, then I need to write detailed feedback, give it back to the AI so it can refine those test questions, and then gives me the output again. And we're going to loop through this until I'm happy with the output. Once I'm happy with the output, it's okay, yes. Then I'm going to go back to the AI, and together, we're going to see if we need to fine-tune the skill. So for example, if it creates 10 test questions for me, and I have 4 pages of feedback to give it, that means the specialist is still not working very well, right? So after we go through the process of giving feedback, it rewrites the questions until they're okay for me. Then at the end of that session, I'm going to ask the AI, okay, given all the feedback we had in the session, how can we improve the skill? There's clearly some gaps there, and we're going to work together to find out how we can fine-tune the skill, right? And then we plug back into the normal workflow where I update Coda and the new assessment is in the app. All right, so I can show you quickly how this is working. Just a second. Yeah, so this is my Claude setup. I'm using Cowork for this. So remember I said projects, right? I want something that's going to keep the memory over time or context over time and actually compound that context. So I go to my projects and you see here I have a Beanstalk project set up. And if I want to work with, let's see, I'm just copying back up a prompt here. So if we're going to create some new test questions, right? So I would go in here and I would say, okay, can you tell me how many test questions we have per persona and per maturity level, right? So first I wanted to take a look and say, okay, we need to work on some test questions. Let's see where we don't have good coverage, right? So it's going to work through this now. And it's going to give me back an answer to show me, okay, the different career paths or personas that we have in Beanstalk and how many test questions we have. Let's see how long this takes. Thank you. I don't need that. One of the things I like about Claude is you can see a lot of the way that it's thinking and what it's doing. And it shouldn't take that long. Okay. And this is showing like how I would normally work with this, right? So if I go like, okay, we've been adding a lot of test questions lately. If I want to continue focusing on that, so this is the first place I would start, right? So what's the current status we have for test questions and where would we work on next? We'll see. When I tested this morning, it took less than 30 seconds. There it is. Okay, good. Okay, so it's showing me, okay, for each persona that we have, here's how many test questions we have. We see for the first personas we created, of course, we have a lot of test questions. For the newer personas we created, we don't have many test questions yet. And then it's breaking it down by maturity levels. So for Scrum Master, level 1, 2, 3, and 4, how many test questions do we have, etc. So based on this, sorry, just copying the next prompt. I can tell it, okay, okay, we already created the learning objectives, maturity model, and assessments questions for the design thinker persona. That's the last assessment question that we worked on. So there's all the reference material there, and I'm asking to create 14 test questions, one for each new assessment question that we have, right? And what you're going to see here is as soon as I ask this, it's going to take a little bit longer, so I'm going to switch back to the presentation in a second, but I want to show a key part. You see what it says here? I'll use the Beanstalk test question skill for this. Let me load it and gather the design thinker reference material. So when I create the skill, and we'll go through the skill in a second, there is a trigger for it. So I'm asking it here to create new test questions. And that makes Claude already know, okay, then I need to use the skill that we created for this. So it's pulling up that skill and it's going to work through it to create some test questions. All right, so while it does that, I'll hide this screen. And we go back to the slides. There we go. So keep in mind, some of the numbers here. productivity gains, right? So when I took measurements, of course, because I wanted to make sure that this is helping me be more productive. So before, when I had to write 40 test questions, that took me about 4 hours. I don't know, maybe some of you think that's fast, maybe some of you think that's slow. That's how long it took me to write 40 test questions. Usually we have test questions for level 1 and 2 maturity, so not very advanced ones yet. But it took me about 4 hours. Writing 40 test questions now using my specialist takes 30 minutes. Now, why 30 minutes? Because it's not going to take it 30 minutes to generate the questions for me. I was just checking if it's done already. No, it's not done, but it's getting close. But it probably takes 2, 3, 4 minutes, right? But the problem is I'm still reviewing every single test question. I'm still reading every test question it creates. I'm going through all the choices, and I'm making sure that, it's okay for me, that it matches the style and the level of question we want. Sometimes in the first test questions it was created, for example, it was like, if it was a multiple choice one, it was like, there's one clearly right answer and then 3 obviously wrong answers. I'm like, no, this is too easy. Can't be like this. So you're always like reading every single one and giving feedback. So it still takes about 20, 30 minutes per 40 test questions that I want to create. The importance of the trust dial and product ownership, right? So I could do this faster. If I say, okay, these are just test questions, I just want to focus on new assessments, I could just take the Excel, like read it diagonally quickly, make sure there's nothing like clearly stupid, and then just upload to Coda. So it'd be close to 0 minutes, but it's that trust dial, right? I don't want slop in my app because that's going to turn away the users. So it's also product ownership, right? I need to make sure that I'm not deteriorating the value of my products just to move fast. So just because the specialist can make you go very fast doesn't mean you should go very fast. You should increase your productivity, your speed, but you still want to manage that and make sure that you're in control, right? And that you're not killing the value of your product or delivering a bad service or whatever your workflow is about, right? And the other thing to keep in mind is training and maintenance time, right? So it's just like a new employee. The first runs that I did for test questions, it took just as long, maybe even a little bit longer, to do it with the specialist, right? Because basically I had feedback on every single test question it created. And we had to go through multiple iterations until it started getting things to a level where I was happy with, that it was aligned to my quality standards, right? And still today, when I use it, that's why I still have there the 30 minutes. It's getting lower. It's probably around 20 now, but still, I'm reading every question, every answer, and I'm still giving some feedback, right? Today, probably 1, 2, 3 feedbacks per run, but I'm still giving feedback to it, still improving that skill. Okay, so another question to everybody, we'll put it on the chat now, but given what we've discussed so far, can you already think of at least one task that you could benefit from having an AI specialist working on it, right? So like an employee you have by your side that, okay, when it comes to this task or this step in the workflow, it's going to be helping me out, right? Do you already have one you're thinking of? Okay, while you guys answer that, we continue. So setting up a specialist, right? So, okay, I showed you what I did from the workflow side, but how did I set up the specialist? So we go back to the different elements in a specialist, but I'll give a little bit more information here. So how to write a specialist, these are the basic blocks you need to make sure you have. So you mentioned the persona, but it's not just the role, but it's you're probably define here the tone and style. So you would say, okay, you need to be professional, you need to write bullet points or whatever it is, perspective, what perspective they should take, etc. The context, right? So what are the reference files that I'm going to be sharing? What is the process that they have to follow? Any rules and constraints to keep in mind? Capabilities, right? So some tools included, some tools are included with the AI tool. So like I said, Excel. If I want Claude to work on Excel, it can do that already. Some other tools are not included and we need to connect them, right? So do I need any tools that are not included? I need to check that. Input, output. So do I have clarity on what is the input that's going to trigger this skill and that it's going to be used? And what is the output that it's going to generate and what's the form of it, the structure, etc. Right? And as we discussed before, the edge cases. So fallback protocols. If you run into problems, do this. When to exit the workflow. If something along the lines of these things happen, then just stop the workflow, right? One of the things I've done with the specialist I'm configuring is when it comes to edge cases, I'm telling it, look, if you don't have all the information, if some of my training materials, you don't find all the information you need to write a good test question, you can assume some things, but in the Excel sheet it generates me, there's now a tab that's called assumptions, and it's basically going to be listing there the assumptions it took. So for question 3, I made this and this assumption. So I can quickly check the assumptions it made and see if it matches or not, right? Good. You could write a specialist like I showed before. I think the easiest way to create a specialist is to basically co-create it together with the AI, right? So you can write a quick first version, right, where you give it a role, like the basic process, you share with it some documents, etc., and then ask AI to sort of go through it and improve it and tweak it and ask you questions to refine it. Most of the popular AI tools, so ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, they have a built-in functionality to help you do this. So it's just going to start asking you questions and helping you create that specialist. My preferred approach, the one that worked the best for me with the different tests I did, was to basically use AI as a thinking buddy on the first run through, right? So what I did is, okay, hey, for the Beanstalk app, we have the assessment questions. We need to create some test questions here. So it's just a session we were working on test questions. I said, so let's start with creating 10 test questions for the product owners. Just show me the questions first, not the answers. Let's just check the questions. And it shows me the questions. I give some feedback. We iterate through it. Okay, now let's add the multiple choice things. And we iterate through that and we go through it. And at the end of that session, I have 10 questions for product ownership that I'm happy with. And then I told it, okay, now review everything we did in this session and create a skill that's able to handle this, right? So the benefit of that is I've worked with the tool for this session to create those test questions. So there's a lot of little things that come up when you're co-creating it that you might miss when you're trying to just write down the process or something like that. And because we work together in it, when it creates the specialist afterward, it's already starting with some additional context and reference material that I might have missed if I just try to create the tool from the specialist from scratch. Good. So training and maintaining a specialist. You need to plan time to train and refine the specialist. Remember, in the beginning, there was no productivity gain for me on those test questions. I was spending just as much time. But of course, that time reduces drastically after the first 2-3 runs if you're giving it good feedback and you're doing a good job in refining that specialist, right? But it is important to invest that time and give good feedback. That's how you improve the specialist. If not, it's always giving you some more or less outputs that then you still have to put a lot of work in and you're probably not gaining that much from it, right? Also a good idea to involve others in testing, right? To avoid tunnel vision or something like that. So I might think, wow, these are amazing test questions, but I'm showing them to my colleagues and like, hey, what do you think about these test questions for product owners? And getting some feedback there. I also encourage people to focus on setting up one specialist at a time. Like you can immediately start thinking like, oh, I should have a specialist for this and one for that. Focus on one and make sure it works well, that you're, on that trust thing and like that you're happy enough with the work it's generating. And once you're happy enough, even if you're still like, maybe it still needs some tweaks once in a while, but it's solid, then you move on to the next one, right? Because this is also going to help make sure that you don't, if you're in a workflow, you might be using multiple specialists for different tasks. It makes sure that you can spot the error if something goes wrong, right? And it's also a good idea, once you're happy with a specialist, make sure you have a test that's checking to make sure it's working as expected. If you have a human in the loop workflow, so for the test questions, for example, it's giving me the Excel and I'm checking the Excel, that's my test, right? Because every time I use it, I see the Excel and I see if it's broken or not. But if it was not, if it was like a higher trust thing, or if it's just sending off a file to somebody else, you need to have some test that's making sure, I don't know, once a week you want to test to make sure the specialist is not degrading or problems have not emerged or coming up. And last thing here, I want to talk a little bit about like different types of specialists you can create, right? And there are others. I'm highlighting some of the main ones I've been playing around with. So one is like the challenger, the grill me, like, so tell me what I'm thinking, tell me where I'm wrong, or tell me where my plan is not good. The proxy customer, you should always talk to your customers. I'm not suggesting this is the best idea, but I work with a lot of companies that people don't have direct access to customers, right? You can create a specialist that kind of represents your persona, and it's going to ask you questions from that perspective. It's a low-cost, fast way to do some concept testing. The doer, right? So like my test question one, it just does a task. I give it a job, and it's going to output me some test questions. The researcher, so it's going to help me understand everything I need to know about a certain topic. The translator, right? It's going to rewrite things so that this other audience can understand it. So from technical to non-technical, or from one language to another. The synthesizer, so it's going to take large amounts of data and say, hey, here's the key things you need to know about this. Or the auditor, right? So somebody that's checking compliance to specific policies or processes that we might have. All right. And we still have two more topics. We're at 42 minutes already. Well, we started 2 minutes past, but we might go 4 or 5 minutes over. We'll see. Human in the loop workflows. So you have my current workflow for the create assessment questions, right? And you notice there's 3 swim lanes here. There's the specialist, there's the thinking buddy, and then there's the human. So the 3 steps in the workflow that I focused on right now is create maturity model, create assessment questions, and write test questions. And you see there at the top the trust level I have for the specialist for each of those steps, right? So for the write test questions, I said, okay, there my trust level is fairly high. It's towards the end of the workflow. I've already created a lot of the content and a lot of the value in that workflow. But for the create maturity model and create assessment questions, no, my trust level is low. Why? Because that's a differentiator for us. I want to make sure that this is embedding our perspective, our knowledge, our experience. So I changed a little bit the color here on the boxes, but you can see, like, in the create maturity model, the first step is with the human. I'm defining the high level maturity model. Then I use the thinking buddy to help me challenge it, refine it a little bit. And then I have a specialist created that's just going to kind of like the grill me, just try to break down my maturity model or challenge it, right? And I'll see based on those challenges if I need to update it, am I okay with it or not? And then we move on to the next one. But the first step in the maturity model starts with me. Create assessment questions, same thing. First step starts with me. I'm going to define the high-level assessment questions. Then I'm going to use the thinking buddy to help me sort of work on the phrasing a little bit and fine-tune this and try to spot some gaps, etc. And once I'm happy with that, then we use the specialist I created there to challenge the assessment questions I created. Once I'm okay with that, then we move to write test questions. But you see on the write test questions, the first step is with the specialist. Why? Because I have a higher trust on that step, right? So the specialist actually already does the first step. And then I'm reviewing the test questions in the end and giving feedback and refining the skill if necessary and continue. So you see how different steps on the workflow might have different trust levels, and this impacts how, let's say, the core part of the work is being done and how your workflow looks like. Some key points to consider: keep your workflows up to date. Define metrics, right? So we're talking about like being more productive or gaining some efficiency. Well, you need to measure to make sure that this is really happening, right? Another thing to keep in mind, currently AI usage is subsidized, right? So it takes, they're losing money on a lot of these queries or prompts that we're writing. So costs are going to change over time. So we need to keep tracking that so you can adapt when necessary. Remember the trust dial, aligns on level of trust. Think about the work you're doing, whether it's for a product or just for a workflow that you're the owner of. How much should you trust the specialist here? Make sure you do quality checks. They should be part of the workflow, so that it helps you also identify when the specialist is degrading, and prefer to make more granular specialists, right? So instead of creating one mega specialist that does 5 steps at once, create one specialist for each step. It's just easier to bug fix if something goes wrong. It's easier to spot which part of the workflow is failing if something happens, etc. It's much easier to maintain them. And I'll repeat myself, quality checks are critical. So this happened like when I was working in the beginning. I noticed that it didn't follow the process I had defined in the specialist, right? In this Claude skill, I had defined a process to follow, and it skipped a step. So then I asked it, hey, why did you skip the step? And I love this. It just said, I skipped it. Yeah, and I shouldn't have. My favorite sentence is at the bottom where it says, regarding whether the skill needs updating, the instructions are already clear. It's not a gap in the skill, it's a gap in following it. Where I was going like, I thought this is what you're supposed to be good at, like following rules, not doing whatever you wanted. But the point is, like, AI makes mistakes, right? It's going to, here, if you read the middle part, like it's describing some kind of like, I felt I had good enough information and there was some pressure to deliver fast, which I don't know where it came from because I never said anything about that, but it just kind of like did the whole task. It's very eager to do the work, right? So also check that it's following the process that you're doing, because if it's not following the process you set up, some errors might happen or some additional loss of time might occur. All right, so the last topic we need to cover, I maintain that we're going to finish 3-4 minutes late. So the specialist library, right? So we talked about you're going to be creating many specialists, which means after a while you need to make sure, if you're working for yourself, it can get confusing if you have like 20 different specialists, because you might want to reuse one for a different workflow. If you're working with a team, then even more, you need to have a good handle of what I call a specialist library, right? What are the different specialists I have and what's going on with them? So the key elements of a specialist library, and for the tool here, just to make a comment, I'll give some examples in the handouts you receive for the masterclass. But basically, common tools here are Airtable, Notion, Coda, the one I use, or you can just use a plain Excel or Google spreadsheet, right? Something like that. And the bullet points I'm putting here, if you're using an Excel sheet, just to simplify, would be like columns in your Excel sheet, right? So what is the name of the specialist and a short description of what it does? Who owns it? A human, of course. And what is the status? Is it currently in development? Is it currently being used? Maintenance. When was the date that it was last updated? When was the last time somebody changed the specialist or reviewed it? When was the last time it was tested for quality, right? So that we make sure it's still giving the outputs we need. What is the minimum LLM or the target LLM that it needs to run it? So I've also been experimenting on, for some things I try Sonnets, then I try Opus and try different LLMs. You might have, and you will figure out that, for this one, we can use a cheaper version. It's okay. For this one, we need to use a more expensive LLM because it needs the extra thinking power, right? So what is the minimum LLM that we need to run it? Inputs and outputs, so a description of the inputs, description of the output. And the content, right? So what is the prompt or the content of the specialist itself? Normally, you wouldn't put this in the Excel sheet. You would put a link to your Google Drive or your SharePoint, and you have like some kind of document there with the prompt. But also files required, right? Imagine you're in a team and somebody wants to reuse the specialist you created. Okay, if you want to reuse it, here are the files you're going to need to provide to it as examples or for your context or inputs, etc. Right? So these would be the different elements of your library. And some key points to consider here. So if you work on a team, make sure you have clear working agreements about reusing and updating specialists. I don't want to spend, 2-3 weeks configuring a specialist that does this thing really, really well, and then have a teammate just come over and like, oh, but I don't really like, and starts changing it because they're not happy with it, but it was working for me, right? So you need to have clear working agreements. How do we manage this? Develop a habit. The easiest way to do this is to have a workflow step of reviewing the skill. So every time you use the skill, it's a good habit to ask the question, hey, do we need to update the skill or was everything okay, right? And also define a mechanism to check if the skill is degrading, right? Because it can happen over time as the inputs might be changing a little bit or for a variety of reasons, it can degrade over time. So have a mechanism to check that it's still working fine. Good. Now it's your turn. So what did we learn today that you can already use? Think about your workflows, right? The things that take your time. Prioritize them using those techniques that we described in the beginning. Figure out which of your workflows would be a good candidate for a specialist. And then create and train your specialist, right? So pick one, a task or a step, and try to create a specialist to help you with that task. You can do it in a very low risk way, like my test question one right now, where it's basically giving me an Excel file that then I upload myself to the database. So it cannot break anything in production, but it's already saving me 3.5 hours per 40 questions, like we said before, right? So try it out. The best way to learn it is by trying it yourself. And join us next time, probably after the summer, for our next masterclass, as we give you little nuggets of our AI learning journey, where we're going to be talking about assistants, right? Where there is a lot of human involvement, but these agents that have a lot more autonomy in what they're doing and not just handling like one specific thing like the specialist. I hope to see you there. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and good luck.